Anita, I'll bring you in. Paul, I'll bring you in. Anybody else who wants to come in, please feel free to come in. Just, we'll bring you in. Anita, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, just bouncing off your point about China, they are taking a long-term perspective, and fundamentally that's what's the biggest threat for us, because everything is being shaped by short-term economic and political drivers. And in terms of what we're seeing, we're so focused on those. You just need to look at news coverage. It's just hopping and skipping between one thing and the next, but that's because the way in which we consume our news is focused on that. And the other dimension, obviously, is social media and the way in which civil society is coming into the picture as well. But and we could have conversations about control as well, but we don't want to get into the weeds at this point.
I mean, Toby Harris, we both know very well, always calls it NIMTO, not in my term of office. And then the question is whether within a democratic system, a 3-year, 5-year political cycle is the way you do this stuff. I'm sure you remember some years ago, they had the missile, basically, peace talks with North Korea, and there was North Korea, South Korea, Russia, China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Russia, China, and Japan and the States, sorry, in America. 6 point. I knew one of the Japanese guys who was in the room. And he said to me, basically, Japanese political strategy is about 15 to 25 years. Chinese political strategy is about 100 years. They're quite comfortable with 100. You look at Tibet and Taiwan. American political strategy is about 6 weeks. And that's being polite. And then suddenly they'll just completely and utterly change everything 6 weeks later. Under Trump, of course, that's much shorter.
Just one more thing. Basically, just again, springboarding off what you said about Trump. What Trump has done has, in a sense, just revealed overtly all these dynamics that we were just not that acutely aware of, and what was going on behind the scenes in relation to, for example, rare earths, and all the geopolitical developments that we were seeing. We didn't really understand it, and whatever he has done, he has brought that to the fore, and we are all now more acutely aware of geopolitics and what the underlying agenda is, beyond peace, security, and all the good words that we've been hearing for many decades.
It is. You're absolutely right. In 2010, I don't know if you're around, Anita, but in 2010, 2011, IISS, International Institute of Strategic Studies, had a China program. And what they did was they invited Chinese, usually junior ministers, 40 years old, over to have a chat. And these were really impressive people. So 40 years old, many of them Western educated, American educated, very nice, very confident. You think, well, I'd like to have bring them over on a Saturday afternoon and have a beer with him, nice people. And I remember they were talking in the room, and at the time, the question was, will China be a good neighbor? That was a question. Will China be a good neighbor? They were stretching their muscles across, around the Asia-Pacific rim. And somebody said in the meeting to this minister, was China prepared to play by the rules? And the minister looked around the room and went, whose rules?
Yeah.
They're your rules, baby. They ain't my rules. They ain't my rules. I have a Japanese background, so I speak Japanese, and in Japanese it's chukoku. I don't know what's called in Chinese, but it's basically the middle kingdom. As far as they're concerned, China is the center of the world. That's what it is. It's a real pity. We had Jeff Stern here, who is an old friend of ours, but he's at Georgetown University and he runs the FEMA program at Georgetown. So it'd been interesting to get some of him on. Paul Cornish, meanwhile, and in no way am I suggesting that you are a replacement or a second choice after Jeff Stern. That was not how that was meant to come out. Professor of Strategic Studies at University of Exeter. Paul, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this, please.
David, thank you very much. I found that really really interesting. If I just chuck a few quick comments in. The first is yet another book to add to your reading list, which is really excellent and extensive. You might well have come across it by Jonathan White, just quite recently published. He's a professor at the LSE, and the title is "In the Long Run: The Future as a Political Idea," and I found it fascinating, and will plagiarize from it endlessly. And I also wanted to begin by quoting. My interest is really in how you deal with the future as a strategic problem in defense policy and security policy and all that kind of stuff. I've always been struck, and I've always used a quick comment by J.K. Galbraith, the economist, the late economist, who liked to divide forecasters, as he called them, between, quote, those who know they don't know and those who don't know they don't know, which I thought really gets to the point. On the subject of geopolitics, I've also been interested in the way that it's been, well, just a few years ago, really, it was brought back into mainstream discussion, and there was a bit of a debate about whether it was the same or different from political geography. What do the two mean? But anyway, we're now in this, we went into a kind of geopolitics phase, and some now arguing that we're in a post-geopolitics phase, whatever that could be. But the idea is that we became aware of geopolitics all of a sudden because it had been, I suppose, suppressed. It had the Cold War and the rules-based international order or system, if you're British and insist on that, sort of stamping on its neck and holding it down because the world was sorted out, geopolitics didn't matter. And now it's been revived, and we might even have gone beyond its revival. Anyway, that's an interesting point of discussion. But I also wanted to, if I could, very quickly and finally, to make a quick comment on China. David, you said that China wants chaos, and I do see what you mean, and I think that's quite a usual judgment that's made in discussions about global geopolitics. But I kind of disagree with it on the basis of. Well, no, I don't disagree. I just don't think it goes quite far enough, I suppose.
Or as long as you don't say, Dr. Rubin's interesting theory.
Interesting.
In which case, then the gloves are off. But besides that, yeah.
It's just on the basis. And funny enough, I've done this work with ISRM, which you mentioned, and it's the UK-China cybersecurity dialogue I've been involved in for several years now. And we go to Beijing, and they come to us, and we just try and keep this track 1.5 dialogue going, as it's called. And what's struck me over these years is that the Chinese do not want chaos. They think that it's the vulgar Russians who do the chaos thing. What the Chinese want is opportunity, which they see developing out of weakness or hesitation or whatever. So that's what they're looking for. But what they then want to do in order to exploit that opportunity is they need order. So every time I've been to China and had that sort of discussion that you had, or your colleague had, do the Chinese want some form of order? They've all said, of course we do. Of course we do. That's how we benefit. That's how we can keep our massive economy going. We need predictability and order. It's just that here's our challenge. We're really not having it. We're not having the Western order that you've been shoving down our throats for the last, or since 1947 or whatever. We want that. We want the expression they've often used is we want to be on the top table. So I always say to myself, whatever you think of the Chinese regime, and there's a lot to think ill of it, you can kind of understand their point of view, really. They're very big and they've got lots to do and they do need order, but they're also looking for opportunity.
And it's very interesting, Paul, because as you know, the UK government it has not quite worked out what its attitude towards China is. The Strategic Security Review basically said it's a strategic threat. Yeah. And at the same time, we're allowing them to build our nuclear. We were allowing them to use our national nuclear and our communication systems, and sort of basically come into our universities. And MI5 in November stated quite openly that they have been trying to do surveillance, on Westminster. So there's that thing. You. There's you said that there's two sorts of forecasters. Those who know that they don't know. There are basically two sorts of people in the world, Paul. There's people who think there's two sorts of people in the world, and there's people who are more sensible than that. which is a Zen koan. You can get deeper and deeper into that as you get into it. And of course, Niels Bohr. You talked about J.K. Galbraith, but Niels Bohr, the physicist, said forecasting is very, very difficult, especially when it's about the future. And I think it's all right. Let's bring anybody. I don't see any hands up. If anybody else would like to come in, Michael Wags, we bring you in. But if anybody else would like to, Nick, you come in. But I would like to bring in two people before we finish. I'd like to bring in Marco, because you've been down on the front line for this, down in East Africa, and Bear will bring you in because you're on the front line in Ukraine, and you guys all got. I want to keep it geopolitical. We both have a perspective on that. Michael, would you like to bring in Lawrence? I've just seen your hand up. We'll bring you in as well. Michael Wag, would you like to come in and have a chat?
Hello, everybody. Long time. There's just so much going on, David, that I could talk about now. I look at everything that's happening, the whole Davos thing. Canada's speech was pretty amazing, but he didn't actually say that there was anything wrong with the system, only that he didn't like to come under attack from it himself. So, that's quite an interesting twist on that. Venezuela, I was actually there when the president was kidnapped. There's going to be an interesting year coming ahead there, I think. And from a risk management point of view, I think the biggest risk coming out of Venezuela at the moment is how the people are going to react to how they're going to be treated by America. Because, things aren't perfect there by a long stretch, but they do have their patria, and they don't really like the idea of somebody coming in telling them what to do. So I think, from my point of view, South America is going to be a big place to watch in the next 6 months.
Of course, China's big in there. The bank, the national bank.
They're the bankers of South America at the moment. Ecuador,
exactly.
Venezuela. You know what I mean? All the drugs are coming out of Ecuador at the moment, as you know, and all the money going into Ecuador is coming from drugs or China.
There you go.
So
it was very interesting. I think it was about 2012, and some of you probably know better this, but around 2012, 2013. You went anywhere in South America and you went to a hotel, not the five-star hotels, but the second-rate hotels. And suddenly they had a Chinese breakfast bar. And you said, right, they're in. Because suddenly that was a thing. It had never been a thing before.